Hello everyone, welcome back. This is the second of two videos on foreign policy. In this one, basically we're going to the history of United States foreign policy. This is a picture from the Spanish-American War, 1898. That is Theodore Roosevelt. This is before he was president, but he was leading his own group of soldiers called the Rough Riders in the Spanish-American War. Basically, we're gonna go through the periods in the evolution of U.S. foreign policy. From 1787 to 1898, the focus was mainly on territorial expansion. In other words, the acquisition of the territory that became the United States as we know it today. And we're going to talk briefly about the Monroe Doctrine and the notion of manifest destiny. This was the Monroe Doctrine, basically, and manifest destiny were the idea that it was the United States' destiny, so to speak, to acquire and dominate this gigantic swath from the Atlantic to the Pacific of all this land, and that the Europeans had no role in it. And that was the Monroe Doctrine, the idea that the Europeans should stay out of this, that it was our business. And then we'll cover the period of 1898, which is the Spanish-American War, through 1945, the end of World War II, and the rise of the United States as a world power. From 1945 to 1989, we have this period that we call the Cold War. And we'll talk about that, and the idea of a bipolar world, meaning two large nations, the United States and the Soviet Union, as sort of poles, opposite poles, that were kind of organizing and dominating global politics. That period of 1989 through 2001, when many people thought there was only going to be one pole, and that was the United States as the center of everything. But it turns out, as of 2001 to the present, things like the global war on terror and other things that have happened around the world have made it very clear that the United States does not dominate the world, and that whole thought was kind of crazy in retrospect, but that isn't many people thought. Then we'll talk a bit about the foreign policies of Presidents Obama, Trump, and Biden. So manifest destiny. Now this is a phrase that was coined by a journalist. This is a famous, by the way, this is a very famous photograph. It is called American Progress by a man named John Gast. The phrase manifest destiny was coined in 1845 by a journalist. And he was specifically saying essentially it was the destiny of the United States to acquire and control Texas and Oregon. But it came more broadly, well, it came to be used by Jacksonian Democrats and others as late as the 1850s to talk about something broader, which was the expansion of the United States from the U.S. of the United States all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. It was the idea that was promoted at that time that it was simply going to happen. It was inevitable, and that this picture, Manifest Destiny, shows that. Now you can see that it really, if you look at it like it was on a compass, you can see everything going from east to west. You see everyone is moving from east to west as the expansion did. So you see, the wagons, you see the settlers, you see train in the background, you see it being guided by an angel, you see. And that was this almost religious notion that, it was religious for many people. They felt that somehow it was ordained in the universe that the U.S. was supposed to acquire all this territory. Now, later on, we began to use the term manifest destiny in more recent times to connote the belief that, our way of government, our way of life was somehow going to be adopted by everybody. That's almost like manifest destiny. The idea that, China and Russia and countries in Africa and Asia and Latin America are all want to become like us, are all going to become like us. That was an extension of this manifest destiny idea. Of course, the world is way more complex than that, and that is not the case at all. But that doesn't stop many people from arguing that it is true, even though the evidence shows that it is not true, that everyone wants us. So now I'm going to talk with you a bit about this territorial expansion, and you can see here the 13 original states and then the territory they acquired. So you see, the 13, as you know, the 13 original colonies and states are along the easternmost part of the United States. But then there was this territory, which includes Illinois, that we acquired in essence with the settlement of the Revolutionary War and what followed. Then 1803, the Louisiana Purchase, this enormous amount of property that was acquired from France. And then we have these other bits and pieces, the Oregon Territory, the Texas annexation following the war with Mexico, which was, which involved basically a plan by slave-owning Southerners to acquire Texas from Mexico, to basically steal it through war, and then turn it into a slave state, which it was. That's what they essentially did. So, Texas actually seceded from the Union along with the rest of the South in defense of slavery in 1861. But it has never, of course, has never been returned to Mexico. Then there was the acquisition of Florida from Spain, the Mexican Cession, which, it wasn't just Texas, but of course, what we also acquired in the Mexican Cession was California, Nevada, most of Arizona, etc., those other states that are in light green. So through the war with Mexico, we acquired a vast amount of land in the West. That was all part of Mexico. And then we acquired Alaska from Russia and this sort of thing. So you can just see how the U.S. was built. And this really was a large part of our foreign policy, was basically acquiring land from other countries. And you can see how much it was. I mean, we're going through time here and how much land was acquired. The total's at the bottom. So you can see how much was acquired. The territory in 1790 it was 891,000 square miles, and by 1990 it was 3.7 million square miles. And you can see how much was acquired in each one of these. Some of these acquisitions were really enormous. The Mexican Cession, 530,000. Louisiana Purchase, 831,000. These are massive acquisitions of land. So then the Spanish-American War, we acquired some territories that eventually became could potentially become states, but have not. Alaska and Hawaii were territories that became states. There have been efforts to, some people in Puerto Rico want Puerto Rico to become a state. That's conceivable. But, it's these are territories of the U.S. now, and they could all potentially, I suppose, if the citizens wanted that and if the Congress wanted it, I mean, it is conceivable that territories can become states, as Alaska and Hawaii did. Now, 1898 to 1945 is this period when the U.S. went from being kind of a backwater in world affairs, previous to 1898, to becoming a global military, economic, and diplomatic power. And this is a poster from World War I, where you see a World War I U.S. soldier saying, "And they thought we couldn't fight." So, in large part, what happened was war was what put U.S. power on center stage in global affairs. It was first the Spanish-American War. What's the significance of that? Well, in the Spanish-American War, the U.S. went to war with one of the great European empires, which was Spain. Spain was an imperial power, as you know, that conquered vast amounts of territory all over the world. Now, Spain was in decline as an imperial power at the time we finally went to war with them, but there were many people in the United States who wanted a war to happen between the U.S. and Spain because they wanted to put the U.S. on the map, so to speak, as a global power, and it had that effect. But then comes World War I, and the U.S. was heavily involved in World War I, came in the last 2 years of the war, 1917 and 1918, and to really probably turned the tide in that war. And so that, again, placed the U.S. as an important power. Then, of course, there's World War II in 1941. The war started in 1939. We joined it in 1941. And by the end of World War II, these major European powers were basically large parts of the countries were destroyed. I mean, German cities and Their industrial centers were pulverized. France was conquered by the Germans. Much of it was destroyed as well. The United Kingdom, UK, we all know about the bombing, the Germans bombing London, and they had depleted themselves and their resources fighting the war, tremendous losses. And the U.S. became a very important Western nation with a very strong military and economy. I mean, not one battle was fought in the actual lower 48 of the United States. There was no bombing, there was no fighting here. And after World War II, while the major European nations were rebuilding and losing their overseas colonies at the same time, the United States immediately went into confrontation with the Soviet Union instantly. And the pivotal period here, what we call the Cold War, was 1945 to 1989. Now, this is a picture from 1944 of Winston Churchill, President Franklin Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin trying to decide how to carve up Europe after the war. And at the Yalta Conference, because by then it seemed clear that the Germans were going to lose and the Allies were going to win. And by the way, in case you don't know this, the Soviet Union fought on our side in World War II against the Germans. And so then the Cold War, however, really changed that alliance. We, the United States and the UK, immediately began to view the Soviet Union as the next enemy. For a whole variety of reasons, they were viewed as an expansionist power that was going to be moving into the vacuum created by the destruction of German ambitions to run Europe. Suddenly they felt it was going to be Stalin and the Soviet Union, and so we went into conflict with them. There are a couple of important articles. One it's called the X article. It was in a very important journal, Foreign Policy, written by a diplomat. His name was actually George Kennan, but he identified himself simply as X. And he said that if we contained the Soviet Union, prevented them from expanding, eventually their economic system and political system were so inefficient and counterproductive that the country would collapse from inside. And interestingly, that is in essence what happened, but it didn't happen until 1989. Because this article came out in the 1940s. And then there was another article, National Security Council report number 68, or NSC 68, which portrayed the Soviet Union in a much more dangerous way, as a much more dangerous country that had to be confronted militarily at every turn and rolled back. So these two articles became sort of the, I guess you'd say, the poles in an argument in the United States over our foreign policy regarding the Soviet Union. Should we simply try to contain them, or should we go into full opposition with them and try to roll back their gains around the world? And we as a result, we ended up fighting wars. What we called them at the time proxy wars. Proxy is a substitute. So we would back one side, the Soviet Union would back the other, usually. And then also China, because China became a communist country as well. And the Korean War, 1951 to 1943, we're fighting a war in Korea that led to a partitioning of the country. Chinese were backing North Korea. We were backing South Korea. The nation got partitioned as a result of all that. The Vietnam War, which was one of the greatest catastrophes in U.S. Foreign policy history, in which we propped up a puppet government of a nation that we called South Vietnam, and took over from the French in doing that. And it was a disaster, a war that we lost. And then many, many other open and covert activities in Latin America, Asia, Africa, and Europe, where we backed governments that were friendly to us and to American corporate interests, and where the CIA was involved in assassinating leaders of other countries and staging coups, Iran, Chile, Congo, and elsewhere around the world. And much of this took place during the 1950s and early 1960s. At the same time, that this aspect of the Cold War, the proxy wars, was going on, at the same time of the containment and the rollback efforts, was a nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union, in which the logic was something that we called mutual assured destruction. For short, we called it MAD. The idea that as long as both countries had sufficient nuclear weapons that they could guarantee they could destroy the other country, then we'd have world peace. And that's why many people thought MAD was a good acronym, that it seems so crazy. The idea was that even if the Soviet Union launched a preemptive first strike against us that we didn't expect, no matter what they did, we'd still have enough nuclear weapons left, and submarines floating around or elsewhere, to be able to destroy them. Same thing on their side. Even if we launched a first strike against them, we couldn't obliterate their total nuclear capacity. They'd still be able to inflict unacceptable losses on us. That was the logic of MAD, mutual assured destruction. And many strategic thinkers thought that produced stability and actually prevented nuclear war. I mean, we did not have a nuclear war during the Cold War, so that is their evidence that it supposedly worked. So in World War II, and this is just, I'm going to just summarize a bit of what happened at the end of World War II and how we emerged as this superpower. There, how did it happen? Because it tracks what you may remember from the first video, where I talked about how the U.S. has worked through international organizations. So let's talk just a bit about that. The first and probably most important of these is the United Nations, which was formed right at the end of World War II, 1945. Now, why do I say that the U.S. works through the UN very effectively? Well, because there are two parts to the UN, the Security Council and the General Assembly. So all the nations in the world are in the General Assembly. They're all equal. But there's a special body called the Security Council. It has 15 members. 10 of them rotate. Could be any 10 from the General Assembly. But there are 5 permanent members of the Security Council. The United States, and then originally the Soviet Union, which then their seat was taken by Russia, the United Kingdom, France, and China. The nations that were viewed as the victors in World War II. All those nations have a veto power. They were the permanent members. They can veto any action the Security Council takes. They can basically prevent the UN from doing anything. So, like when the U.S. invaded Iraq in violation of international law, it was impossible for the United Nations to to really condemn what the U.S. did, because the U.S. would veto any effort. When Russia invades one of its neighbors like Ukraine or Georgia or elsewhere, it's impossible for the UN to do anything about it because Russia could simply veto it. Same for UK, France, and China. So we were one of 5 nations that could veto basically any meaningful action of the United Nations. Therefore, all these people who are always talking about how the United Nations works against U.S. interest apparently do not understand how the United Nations works, because it can't do anything unless we approve of it, basically. Or put it differently, if we disapprove of any action that the UN wants to take, that action can't be taken. Now, next thing that happened in 1945 was something called the Marshall Plan, in which we began to increase our influence in Europe by using our wealth to rebuild Europe, including Germany. And we did the same with Japan as well, to help them rebuild. And that enhanced our influence in the world. And then there was this thing called the Bretton Woods Conference, at which a number of things happened. I don't expect you to know all about this. We talked about this in the economic policy section. But basically, global organizations were created. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and then a general agreement on tariffs and trade that eventually came into existence. And other institutions through which the through which the United States can work to influence things that happen in other countries. So these global organizations promoted United States economic and diplomatic power, even though they were international in scope, because we were very influential. In the Cold War included a number of different dimensions, and also involved international organizations. First, I mentioned that the proxy wars. Also, we had a policy providing economic and military aid to countries that were fighting communism, in other words, that were on our side. NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, very important organization in that regard, a collective security pact of these European nations that decided to engage in a mutual self-defense, commitment in Article 5 of the NATO treaty to come to each other's defense if they're attacked. That was all designed out of fear that the Soviet Union was going to invade Western Europe. And they never did, and it is argued that that is because of, at least during the Cold War, and that is argued that it was because of NATO. Now, then there was this thing called the Berlin Wall. And you can see it right there. This is before it was torn down. It divided the city of Berlin between East Berlin, that was part of the communist world, and West Berlin, that was part of the West. And it was a very symbolic thing. I mean, people who tried to escape, who tried to come from the gray area on the left and run across that sort of no man's land and climb the wall, were simply shot to death by East German guards who had machine guns there. So it was quite a real barrier. That's why, President Reagan said, to Russia, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall, because he felt like if you want to act like a normal country, you've got to allow people to leave if they want to leave. You can't shoot them in the back if they want. So in 1956, this is kind of the way we saw the world. A part of the world that was dominated by Russia, and not just by the Soviet Union, and also through their military pact called the Warsaw Pact. So there were the NATO nations, which you see there in green. There were in 1956, other nations, could have joined later, but this is what it was in 1956. And then the Warsaw Pact nations, which included Poland, Romania, and East Germany, etc., that were all allied. And there was great fear that the Cold War would turn into a nuclear war during the Cold War. And fortunately, it didn't. However, when Cuba turned communist in 1959 under Fidel Castro, the United States tried to overturn Castro. We sponsored an invasion run by the CIA called the Bay of Pigs invasion. It failed. The invasion was defeated by the Cuban military. And then the CIA made many attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro and failed. So, sometimes people act like this is, kind of a funny comical history, trying to, because it failed. But of course, there's nothing funny about trying to assassinate the leader of another country, and the United States did that with some regularity during the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, what happened here, this was the closest we came to nuclear war during the Cold War. The Russians, the Soviet Union, put nuclear missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from the United States. Now, the one reason that they felt that was justified was because we had missiles in Turkey, which was at that time basically on the border of the Soviet Union. But President Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, said this is absolutely unacceptable, and he put a naval blockade around Cuba and said, we're not removing this blockade. No ships are getting to Cuba until those missiles are removed. And they were. The Soviet Union removed them, and then we agreed to remove our missiles from Turkey. So it was a negotiated end to what could have been a catastrophe. Could have led to nuclear war. But we also backed, the CIA and other aspects of the U.S. government backed revolutions or armed conflicts in many other countries. We staged a coup in Iran in 1952. We did similar things in Guatemala, Laos, I mentioned Vietnam, Indonesia, Congo, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Brazil, Indonesia, Chile, Greece, Bolivia, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Grenada, and elsewhere. So this was our Cold War policy. Many insurgencies that we either armed or organized in countries around the world. The Vietnam War, I'll just spend a couple of minutes on that. We got into that because Vietnam was part of the French Empire. And they withdrew from Vietnam in 1954 after a disastrous war that was fought against them by Vietnamese, I guess you would call them fighters for independence. And what happened essentially was Vietnam was partitioned into a communist north and a non-communist south. We backed the southern government in Saigon, and the communist government in the north, which was in Hanoi, was backed primarily by the Soviet Union. Well, a civil war developed, and between North and South, and we intervened militarily to support what was essentially a U.S. puppet government in the South that it turned out had little popular support. We were involved there militarily from 1963 to 1973 under 3 presidents. We don't know. I mean, we estimate, or we officially have determined that 58,000 U.S. soldiers were killed. We don't really know the full scale of Vietnamese deaths. We say about 200,000 South Vietnamese soldiers, but we estimate there were 1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters that we killed, and at least 2 million Vietnamese civilians died. It was a horrible war. And eventually we withdrew. It led to President Lyndon Johnson not running for re-election in 1968. Eventually, Richard Nixon was elected with 1968 with a promise to end the war, and he didn't do anything about it until 1973 after he'd been re-elected. It's a long and very awful story, but it was we lost that war, and it affected us nationally for quite some time, and led many people, and like baby boom generation people like myself, to be very suspicious of American motives in foreign policy. Now, what began to happen toward the end of the Cold War was that the Soviet Union began to express an interest in ending the Cold War. A lot of this came from the Soviet Union. The Premier Brezhnev, you can see him laying at Brezhnev, talking with Richard Nixon through an interpreter. They began to work toward Nixon and Brezhnev began to work towards something they called détente. Détente is a French word which means like an easing of tensions, like a relaxation of tensions. And Nixon began to try to negotiate a change in our relations and an improvement of our relations with the Soviet Union. So from 45 to 70, it was all about the containment and rollback. But then from 1970 to 1981, we began to work on this détente thing. That is throughout, for a number of years, at least a decade, we were trying to engage in arms limitations agreements, some of which were successful. But what happened was, and we were making progress toward that, but then what happened was in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. And at the same time, Soviet-backed Marxist Sandinistas took over in Nicaragua. Now, this is a long story about Nicaragua, but these two actions by the Soviet Union, the invasion of Afghanistan and backing the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, led to a change in U.S. policy, and that was embodied in the election of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan came in and said, to heck with this détente, to heck with better relations. He was a hardcore anti-communist. He viewed the Soviet Union as an enemy, and he did, even though, Richard Nixon, who did this, was a Republican. Ronald Reagan was a Republican, but Reagan was a very strong believer in the Cold War. And he said, we are going to increase our military spending. We're not going to do these arms limitation agreements. We're going to increase our military spending and confront the Soviet Union like we did during the Cold War. And as he said, we are blind to reality if we refuse to recognize that détente's usefulness to the Soviets is only as a cover for their traditional and basic strategy for aggression. Détente is for the Soviet Union a no-can-lose proposition. So he put us back into the Cold War. And we began to spend enormous amounts of money again on a new military buildup. And this is what the world looked like in 1980. So you can see the non-aligned nations. I think the most interesting part of this is the non-aligned nations. You see the nations that were not taking sides in the Cold War are in gray, but the dark blue is the NATO nations. The light blue are other allies. The dark red is the Warsaw Pact, and the lighter red is countries socialist countries that were aligned with the Soviet Union, and then other allies. So, and then much of the world was still in the balance. So I mentioned this speech Reagan gave in 1987, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down the Berlin Wall. We had sometimes called Cold War II during the 80s, where Reagan restarted the Cold War. He changed our policy immediately for 8 years toward the Soviet Union. He called them the evil empire. That was a term he came up with. And we engaged in massive increases in military spending. And this forced the Soviet Union to try to match those expenditures, while at the same time they were trying to build a consumer economy, and it was more than they could really do. One of the key things here was the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, which we undertook, called the Star Wars program. And that referred to creating a so-called space shield over the country. In other words, making it impossible for the Soviet Union's missiles to reach the United States. Now, many defense theorists always believed this was actually impossible, that there was actually no way to do that, to really guarantee that missiles could never strike the country. But it's a fantasy Reagan had, and he talked about it all the time. We also had a massive naval buildup. We began to rebuild and recommission gigantic battleships and that were really obsolete because they're sitting ducks for missiles, aircraft carriers, and so forth. And we began to confront the Soviet Union. We offered aid to the rebels in Afghanistan. Remember, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan? Well, we armed the people that were called the Mujahideen, who were the rebels fighting against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And they eventually won. They eventually took Afghanistan away from the Soviet Union. And among the Afghan rebels who fought against the Russians was a man by the name of Osama bin Laden, who later became the founder of Al-Qaeda. So yes, we gave weapons, aid, and military training to many people who eventually became Al-Qaeda. We also funded the Contras, which is an army, a right-wing army in Nicaragua. And this led to a scandal during the Reagan administration because they funded the Contras illegally. And Reagan was very nearly impeached. In part because of this restarting of the Cold War, the Russian economy began to crumble, and it just, the military spending, the consumer spending was too much for their economy, which was a very inefficient communist economy that, by our standards, was extremely inefficient and ineffective. And basically the Cold War ended under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev. The Soviet Empire collapsed. He came up with two doctrines called perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika referred to economic restructuring of the Soviet Union along the lines of a quasi-capitalist country. This became a disaster. They tried to do it so fast that essentially their economy was taken over by the people who came to be called the oligarchs. And instead of distributing the wealth evenly, they got a group of corrupt, fabulously wealthy people controlling almost every major industry in their country. And another one called glasnost, which is political openness. In other words, instead of putting you in prison for speaking your mind, you would be allowed to criticize the government. And very, very quickly, the country began to fall apart. The Berlin Wall fell. The republics, Germany was reunified, and the Soviet Union basically dissolved. Soviet domination of Eastern Europe came to an end. The Soviet Union literally fell apart as a country. The republics all declared their independence. The countries that they had controlled, like Poland and Romania, decided to go their own way. Some of them wanting to join NATO. And then we found all these people in the United States saying, we won the Cold War, and we now live in a unipolar world where the U.S. is going to dominate everything from now on. This is sometimes called triumphalism. One of the people who is most famous for this is this gentleman right here. He's a political scientist by the name of Francis Fukuyama. And he wrote an article in 1989, later a book, in which he basically said, history has ended. There's not going to be any more history. The U.S.-style liberal democracy is the final form of human government. We are it. And he said, what we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. Now, has he proven to be right? No, he has proved to be wrong. And at the time, another political scientist, this man right here, this is Samuel Huntington, said that's not what's going to happen. He took issue with all that. He said the post-Cold War world will have different types of conflict. History is not over. We're going to have cultural rather than ideological fault lines. So he said China and the Islamic world have different ways of doing things that will lead to conflict. And it's interesting because he said this, of course, long before 9/11 and long before we became involved in wars with Iraq and so forth. He was right, apparently, that cultural conflict was much more important than Fukuyama realized. It was not just about ideology, but there are cultures. And as we have all seen with the rise of China as an economic and political power, they have different ways of doing things, different forms of government, and they are not trying to become like us. And they have different ways, different cultural norms, different types of history, different governing institutions. And so, I think Huntington and other people would say history is definitely not ended. I mean, history is going to be different than it was during the Cold War, but we're still going to see civilizational and global conflict and continued evolution of the ways in which the differing ways in which we run our countries. I just want to talk with you a little bit about the two Bushes as president. Bush 41, George H.W. Bush, was president during the fall of the Iron Curtain and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he, put together the coalition that expelled Iraq from Kuwait after Iraq illegally invaded and annexed Kuwait. He created a U.S. disarmament inspection regime to disarm Iraq. He did not try to depose Saddam Hussein or change their government. And I think most observers said it was a successful effort to support the principle of international law that borders must be respected and one nation cannot invade another. But when his son came in, he went the opposite direction. First, after 9/11, we invaded Afghanistan to overthrow their government. U.S. troops were involved there until 2021 because the government we propped up there could not survive. And in 2003, the illegal invasion of Iraq based on lies that Iraq had restored its weapons of mass destruction programs. Horrible civil war followed, destabilized the Middle East, led to the creation of ISIS, and on. Again, one of the greatest foreign policy disasters in U.S. history. And then we come to 2001 to the present, the so-called global war on terror. Now, this is a controversial period, but understand that in 2001, after the 9/11 attacks, Bush radically changed our priorities in international relations. He said from now on, he was a wartime president. The emphasis on security, the intelligence agencies, military force, the focus on the Middle East, the framing of issues in terms of war, global war on terror. Sure, a lot of this ended, but much of it stayed. In other words, the notion that we would, after the Cold War was over, that we would live in a world that was predominantly peaceful went right out the window. Europe, which is in many respects a competitor with the U.S. and not always in agreement with our goals, but this has always become a factor where, for example, when Donald Trump was president, he viewed Europe as an adversary. We have a different kind of relationship with Europe than we did during the Cold War. During the Cold War, Western Europe was very dependent on the United States for defense, and after the end of the Cold War, not so much. But then again, we all need each other for combating terror networks. So it is a very complicated picture. And then we see the rise of China, economically, especially. It's enormously productive economy, and then increasingly extending its power into the South China Sea, into the Pacific, and its diplomatic power increasing. We see that many nations in Latin America have begun to think that socialism it might not be such a bad idea. Venezuela, for example, Cuba is still socialist. So the socialist experiments still continue post-Cold War. And then we see the issue of Russian aggression in Eastern Europe, in a number of different countries, Ukraine, Georgia, and possibly elsewhere, where Russia has tried to reassert territorial claims to countries where there are Russian-speaking citizens, as if it were the case that, well, if you have people who speak Russian in your country, then your country belongs to us. This is, of course, a totally unacceptable notion in international law. And then the continued problem of what they call failed states, that is, countries where the governments have simply stopped functioning. This is a serious problem. Somalia is one of the best examples, but there are others around the world where a country's government simply cannot guarantee security any longer. And sometimes the government itself ceases to exist, and you have anarchy and warlords and so forth. These are serious, serious problems for in the post-Cold War era. Now, I'm going to talk with you just a little bit in wrapping this up about some of the foreign policy priorities of the last three presidents. President Obama, who, as you know, was president from, well, he won the election in 2008 and was president until Trump was elected in 2016. He came in at the time of a global financial crisis. The world economy had melted down. He was involved and was president during the so-called Arab Spring regime changes in a number of nations where, throughout the Middle East, where there were dictators or authoritarian governments that were overthrown and a number of wars that resulted. He was president when the Iran nuclear agreement was negotiated with a whole bunch of different countries, in which Iran agreed to not develop nuclear weapons, an agreement that was unilaterally rescinded by Trump when he was president. But this, understand this was quite an accomplishment. Iran had agreed not to develop nuclear weapons, and then that we rescinded the agreement. One continued problem was Israeli settlements on the West Bank of the Jordan and their treatment of the Palestinian population in their country and in the territories, occupied territories. Continued source of conflict during his administration. A very important agreement, Paris Agreement on greenhouse gas emissions involving 195 nations, another accomplishment. But then Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014 and annexed Crimea. How did he respond to that? With economic sanctions only. And then there was really probably a fairly serious mistake regarding Syria. Obama, it's a long story, but basically Obama decided not to have the U.S. become militarily involved in any way, any meaningful way, in Syria. And what resulted was a horrible civil war and a gigantic flood of refugees, which I have mentioned in the first video, where 6 million Syrians fled the country and another 6.7 million were internally displaced. Just a massive problem. Now, some say that if we had taken steps to prevent it, that we might have been able to prevent that catastrophe. But we'll never know, because that was not the policy he felt we should pursue, and maybe it wouldn't have worked. We'll just never know. Trump's approach, bordering on isolationism, was basically extracting us from everything. We quit the Paris Agreement on climate change. We quit the Iran nuclear agreement, which means Iran went back to trying to develop nuclear weapons. He tried to make overtures to North Korea, which is a very dangerous country. He made absolutely no progress on that. He made a lot of overtures to Russia, encouraging them to basically do whatever they wanted. Nobody knows quite why he did that, but he did. He treated our allies like Canada and Mexico as if they were our enemies. He disrupted our alliances that had been in place since World War II. He tried to ban Muslims from entering the United States, which went to the U.S. Supreme Court multiple times. He sided with Saudi Arabia in regional conflicts that they had with Iran, including Yemen and elsewhere, and in a way that previous presidents had not really wanted to do. In other words, he felt Saudi Arabia was a very important ally. He supported Israeli claims against the Palestinians, and in a variety of ways that made it, well, that Israel liked very much, and their right-wing government liked very much, but that many people feel made it very difficult for a peace agreement to be negotiated to end the conflict. He attempted and failed to build a wall across the entire border of the United States with Mexico, complete failure. It was never built. We have barriers. We already had barriers across much of the border, but the Great Wall was never built, and probably couldn't have been built. But just in terms of the geography of the area, probably could not ever have been done in the first place. But it was not built. He engaged in tariff and trade wars with Canada, Mexico, the European Union, and China. He refused to accept refugees from Central America. This has been a problem for many presidents, not just Trump. That is refugee flows from Central America are a real issue for the United States. It's unclear what is the best way to deal with those. With so many, in other words, if 3,000 people try to cross the border at the same time, how should the U.S. handle that? That is just a very difficult problem. He also undermined the credibility of the State Department by basically firing everyone who knew anything about foreign policy and replacing them with corporate lobbyists and ideologues who did not understand how foreign policy worked. And by the time he left office, there were serious questions about the U.S.'s future role as a major player in world politics. Joe Biden, on his election, what we had here was a man who had been in the Senate for decades and had spent many years as either the chair or the ranking member, meaning the highest ranking minority member, of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. That, if you'll recall, is the key congressional committee for doing U.S. foreign policy. In other words, what I'm saying to you is Joe Biden came to office knowing a great deal about foreign policy. And when he had been vice president for 8 years, he was involved in a lot of important matters in the foreign policy realm. So he had, of course, a different approach. He had more of the multilateralist approach. He set about trying to repair international relationships that Trump had damaged. He tried to repair the State Department by replacing the political hacks with diplomats. Return to multilateralism, mobilizing international cooperation to deal with many things: COVID, cyber attacks and cyber espionage, climate change, including returning the U.S. to the Paris Climate Agreement, the challenges from Russia and China to international norms and liberal democracy that they both pose. And he withdrew the United States from Afghanistan after 20 years, a step that several presidents had promised to take and never did, but he did. And he resumed, most importantly, U.S. support for and leadership of NATO after the Russian invasion of Ukraine the second time in 2022. Now, Trump was threatening to withdraw the United States from NATO, and was very critical of NATO. But Biden resumed our historic leadership role in NATO. Now, I don't know whose policies you think are the best, but these are clearly differences of the last 3 presidents in that regard. So this is where we are. We are, as of 2022, the U.S. was re-engaged, and global and international organizations that were intended to deal with the kinds of problems that many countries in the world find it impossible to resolve alone. And so this concludes our second of 2 videos on foreign policy. So thanks for listening.